I'm joined by my colleague. Nice. I'm joined by my colleagues, Jessica and Mish, who will be introducing themselves in just a bit. Next slide, please. And so for today, we've got a pretty simple agenda, and since it's a small group of us, we can keep it casual. So first off, of course, in general, we're going to be talking about letters to the editor and why they're such an important advocacy tool. And in having that conversation, we're going to be framing it by looking at proposed pipelines in Virginia and North Carolina and how we can use LTEs as a tool to build opposition against these projects. So once we go into the context, talk about LTEs, we'll have a little bit of time to workshop, start outlining some letters to the editor, and have a bit of a discussion and brainstorm a little bit together. And again, since this is a smaller group, if you have questions along the way, feel free to put them in the chat, or you can just raise your hand, and happy to answer any questions y'all have. All right, next slide. And I'll go ahead and pass it off to Mish to get us started with the context of the proposed pipelines.
Sweet. Thanks, Juhi. Yeah, happy to cover this. And my name is Mish. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I'm the Clean Energy Campaigns Director for the North Carolina League of Conservation Voters. So my job is all about making energy safe, clean, and affordable. And unfortunately for us, we are not seeing that with this gas build-out that's coming. So next slide, please. So this is just an overall map, whether you're located in Virginia or in North Carolina, to just kind of give you an overview of what kind of gas build-out is coming and what we can expect from it. So there are several projects on this map, including gas plants and pipelines that we need to fuel them, but we're going to be talking about two in particular today. So next slide. Thank you. So the first one we're going to cover is the Southeast Supply Enhancement Project. And this is a project undertaken by Williams Transco. So you might hear either of those company names when learning about this project. There are two proposed quote unquote loops for this pipeline. A loop is just a big path for that pipeline. It will run partially along existing right-of-ways, but there will be two segments. The first segment is the Salem Loop, and the second one is the Eden Loop. These are 54 and 36 miles of pipeline along the Virginia, North Carolina border and into North Carolina. And we'll also see some compressor station expansions. This can be really harmful to air quality because compressor stations emit particulate matter. They can worsen local air quality. And yeah, next slide, please. Thank you. So connecting to those Transco extensions, we are going to see potentially a pipeline coming from Dominion called T-15. And I learned a fun fact that the T-15 is just a random code that Dominion has assigned this pipeline. So it doesn't actually mean anything. But it's a 45-mile pipeline connecting to that Transco extension, the Eden Loop. It will go from Rockingham County to Person County, and it's specifically meant to supply gas to Duke's gas plants. And I just want to note that it's being built by a different company, which is Dominion, but there is public record saying that Dominion is supplying gas to Duke's plants. So major utilities are colluding on this gas build out that we're seeing in North Carolina. Next slide, please, Jess. Thank you. So just to simplify the map a little bit, here is where we're seeing the SSEP from Transco in those two yellow orangish lines going down the map up into that upper part of Virginia down into North Carolina. And then the black line is the T-15 pipeline. So we can kind of see how these pipelines are connecting to fuel a really big methane gas build out here in North Carolina. Next slide. Thank you. So as I've kind of mentioned, all of these pipelines are being built to supply gas plants, right? So it's looking like 2/3 of the gas from the SSEP plant would go towards Duke Energy's proposed gas build out. If you're not familiar, Duke Energy is tasked by the North Carolina General Assembly to transition away from coal in the pursuit of carbon neutrality. Unfortunately for us, Duke is not choosing renewable sources. They are choosing to use methane gas, which when combusted still has a ton of air emissions, still affecting the climate. And so it's not the renewable energy transition that we really need here in the Carolinas. As to T-15, it's going to be directly fueling gas plants also built by Duke in northern Person County. It's just being supplied by Dominion. So next slide, please. Thanks. So as I've mentioned, there are a lot of concerns around health, air quality, and water quality. There are 0 pipelines throughout the United States that have never leaked. So every single pipeline across the United States has had some form of a leak. And something that's really concerning is that methane is often odorless. When it's being transmitted across state lines, some states do add some kind of smell or color so that you can see when gas is being leaked through these pipelines. But North Carolina doesn't have major rules like odorants or colorants. So that gas would leak into the air and you would not even know, especially if these pipelines are being built in your backyard. Methane is also a really potent greenhouse gas, meaning it's driving up temperatures in our climate. And I know North Carolina is going through its like fake second fall right now, but it is very, very hot and it continues to get hotter here in the South. There are also a lot of safety concerns around methane gas and the pipelines used to transport it. Methane is highly explosive and combustible, and pipelines have been known to explode without warning, especially here in the Southeast. Next slide, please. And this is just one of the examples of a recent pipeline explosion. This one was back in 2008, but there have been explosions as recently as last year in Virginia. And you see there are injuries, there are huge damages to property, and Transco was fined $950,000 for the specific blast that you're seeing on the screen, but that fine does not necessarily go to the families that are affected by this, right? We see houses that are completely destroyed from the effects of this blast, and it doesn't repair land. That fine does not repair homes, reestablish your property value. So communities have a lot to risk, and there's very little gain. Next slide, please. Thanks. So as I mentioned, communities really don't have a lot to benefit from this. Not only do we have enough methane gas to meet existing electricity demand through 2030, these pipelines do not create extensive numbers of jobs. There are very, very few permanent jobs in these communities. And oftentimes when jobs do open up on pipeline work, companies like Duke and Dominion, they cover multiple states, right? They can outsource for either cheaper or better labor than we would get if we filled those jobs with communities. And that's not helping our communities. That is putting harm in their way without any major benefits. Next slide, please. And of course, like I mentioned, this can affect people's land that they've had in their families for generations. So even if there is an existing pipeline on your land, you have courses of action to get yourself help and protection. And we wanted to specifically highlight that a coalition of organizations like NCLCV and Appalachian Voices, we are here to provide support. We can connect you to free legal support for landowners, and so you can learn how you can protect your rights, protect your property. So just want to highlight the resource on the bottom is nossep.org. That is the website that we have all of our resources and information on for both of these pipelines. So highly encourage writing that down for future use. Next slide. Thank you. So just want to reiterate that all hope is not lost. We have plenty of time to start building power as community and really taking actions on these things, because this outreach for these pipelines has only just begun. So for the SSEP, they have pre-filed with FERC. And just for reference, FERC is the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. Since the SSEP pipeline goes across state lines, it's regulated by the federal government. The federal government does have a pretty long permitting process, so there's a lot of opportunity for us as a community to provide public comments, including letter to the editors. For SSEP, that's the timeline there on the left side of the screen. And for T-15 on the right, permitting won't start until 2024 into 2025, which is right now. That one will go through what is likely to be the North Carolina Utilities Commission here in our state. And so if you're based in North Carolina, I'm happy to talk to you more about what that process looks like. And for both of these timelines, the target in-service date is the same. So that's the end of 2027. But there's still plenty of time for us as a community to mobilize and stop these projects before they get constructed. Next slide, please. And with that, I'll pass it over to Jessica.
Mish, thank you so much. And thanks for laying out what the communities along these routes are facing, this overbuilding of fossil fuel infrastructure within the Southeast. And we're really seeing it happening here at an alarming rate. So really appreciate folks turning in tonight to learn about how to use a letter to the editor as one form of advocacy in fighting projects like the Southeast Supply Enhancement Project or the T-15. So first, to reintroduce myself, I'm the Virginia Field Coordinator for Appalachian Voices. And I'll tell you what, I love writing letters to the editor. I love writing angry letters to the editor. And it is such an effective and satisfying tool in getting great information out there and connecting others to issues, getting factual information out there, and changing the public narrative around an issue. So we're going to go through some of the best practices for drafting a letter to the editor. And then after we go through that, we'll have space for questions, and then we're going to workshop our own letters to the editor together. So I'll start by saying this is an advocacy tactic that many of y'all may have used before, or if you've never written a specific letter to the editor, if you've ever written any kind of advocacy email or a message to someone who's a decision maker, you are on your way to a full letter to the editor. I live in Central Virginia, and Dominion's presence here is really omnipresent. They have a lot of influence politically, socially, culturally. And so the media for many years seemed quite biased towards their perspective on energy projects. And when we saw them try to put the Atlantic Coast Pipeline 600 miles through West Virginia, Virginia, and North Carolina, announced in 2014, the newspapers here and the media coverage really gave Dominion the ability to shape the narrative around the project. And so a team of volunteers, at that time we were operating as a volunteer team with Chesapeake Climate Action Network, decided to make letters to the editors our advocacy tool here in Central Virginia to try and get media coverage changed on this issue. Our major paper here, the Richmond Times-Dispatch, was presenting stories about the project and op-eds that were very biased towards Dominion's opinion. And so we made a very concerted effort that was strategic and collaborative to really bombard them with letters to the editor about this issue so that we would see them change their coverage, increase their coverage on the issue, and give an opportunity for the other perspective on the Atlantic Coast Pipeline, that it would harm all of those, all three states, species, water, communities, land, property rights, and add to the growing climate crisis. And so over the span of a couple months into a year, we really did start to see that coverage shift, and our letters to the editor were working. So we're going to start, let's zoom out a little bit. What is a letter to the editor? It is basically sharing your opinion on an important issue. Tonight, we're talking about the SSEP and T-15, but this is applicable to any issue that is really important to you and you want to get information out about there. It is meant to be concise, which can often be a hard part of that, is kind of narrowing down what you want to say, distilling it to your most effective message. Generally, you're responding to news coverage. A letter to the editor may be in response to a news story about a climate issue or something about the pipeline or the pipeline developers. but it can also be in response to someone else's LTE, to an op-ed you find especially problematic, or a more a less directly connected but thematically connected issue. So it doesn't have to be such a direct response to an article about SSEP. But if you are reading your newspaper and there's an article about climate or weather, there is always a way to bring a response back to the issue you care about. Now, a letter to the editor is something that has a variety of sort of formats for what's submitted, but generally they're between 200 and 500 words for most newspapers. When you get beyond 500, you're approaching an opinion editorial or op-ed, which is also a great way to increase advocacy on any issue you care about. So you can start with an LTE and get that practice of refining what you want to say to such a small word count. What's helpful about a letter to the editor is not only are you reaching the media market that may still get a newspaper subscription and they have the physical copy in their hand, but now that so much of media and some newspapers are completely online, this is appearing in multiple places, print and online, and it is very easy to share, making it able to reach many more audiences. So why are letters to the editor so important? Why are we talking about them tonight? And why do we encourage you to participate in advocacy in this way? It's because you can bring new information and a new narrative to a wider audience who may have never heard about something or has just spent months getting biased or incorrect information from a media source. In the case of the Atlantic Coast Pipeline, my first letter to the editor was a response to a very factually incorrect op-ed from a state senator. So I was able to connect their op-ed about Dominion and their environmental practices to my opposition to the Atlantic Coast Pipeline, which would have been drilled under my drinking water source, the James River. Another reason LTEs are important is that they frame issues in a really personal way. So this is a chance for you to connect the issue to you and to your community. Make it as local as you can when you're talking about it. With the ACP, I was able to share, I am spending time on the James River. It's a place where I recreate. It's important to me and my family. So I was able to talk more narrowly about how it would impact me, but about the issue writ large to make sure people had different ways to connect to it. These are things that are easy to share. It's easy to email to a friend, to put on social media. And that's another way of just keeping conversations going about an issue. That's the most important thing. You, with your LTE, are helping make and frame and keep a conversation going. It does influence coverage going forward. When newspapers receive a lot of interest on one subject, they're much more likely to cover it. And we know for a fact, elected officials and decision makers read the paper. They've got a Google alert set to their name, and they are all about it, and they receive a notification when there is an LTE that mentions them, their ability to make the right decision on an issue or push back on something that they've done. LTEs are also important because in that spirit of keeping conversations going, you are offering next steps for a reader to connect to an issue. That is, to me, the most important component of these. So what makes a good LTE? We've mentioned this a little bit, but being concise, making sure what you're presenting is factually based, that you are responding to something that was recently in the news. The likelihood of being published is higher if you are responding within a day, 2 days, 3 days to something that has appeared in a publication. Connecting it to a local issue is really important too, especially as you consider, am I writing my local paper, my regional paper, a statewide paper? What is the way that it would connect best to that audience? So in Henrico County, where I am, we have the Henrico Citizen. So I might connect an issue to a local water planning issue here. If I'm talking, submitting a letter to the Richmond Times-Dispatch, I might be talking about how this relates to the state legislature and the influence of sort of state electeds and how the Clean Economy Act is affected by the, so you're relating it to something based on the audience of the paper. That is something important to consider. And then always, you want an ask in your letter. You want a next step for whomever is reading this to connect to the issue, to connect to you, and to want to take action. That can be a lot of different things. It can be inviting people to a community event. It can be asking them to call an elected official and ask questions or explain why they are opposed to a project. So for the SSEP, that could be inviting someone to come to an upcoming community event. It could be pushing back and asking, why did this city council or this town council support a project that they don't understand to be unhelpful to the community? So submitting an LTE, this is a form of advocacy that you can do from anywhere at any time, and that's what's really helpful. You can do this, from your phone when you have a spare moment on a weekend or evening. And there's a couple ways to submit them, but generally it's an online form. And so we have prepared some resources that we will also send after this presentation that show you where to submit and some recent media pieces to respond to. So if you're writing your first draft of a letter to the editor, the first goal is making sure you've got concise factual information, that you're responding to something that you saw published, and you're getting your perspective informed by your own personal experience across. You are including something for the reader to do after they finish reading that letter. As you're working on your letter and you're getting it down to that word count, it's great to reach out to a friend who has a similar interest or loves editing and get a second set of eyes on that. Get their interpretation. Is it clear what you're trying to get across? Is it something that's interesting to a reader? Sometimes humor or personal anecdotes can really make a letter much more resonating for people, make them remember it. So those are things to consider too. So if you're responding to an existing publication, get it in as quickly as you can. And I mean, the sooner the better. Washington Post, if you're getting it in within a day, they're more likely to consider it for publication. Some places will tell you whether or not they're going to print your letter. Sometimes they'll send you an automated response. But you are able to follow up with an editor if you've not heard anything back and just say, hey, is this still under consideration? So the final thing I want to sort of touch on here is an example we have of a letter to the editor. So we know that some newspapers, it might be 200 words. So what you're seeing here is pretty long. But the reason I want to share this specific letter with you is, one, it's very good. Two, it's written by someone who is directly impacted by the SSEP. Three, it responds to news coverage that just appeared in the Chatham Star Tribune, which was about local elected officials coming out in support of the project, but not having a clear understanding of how it would actually add to the climate crisis and would not bring the benefits that the company is saying it would. The other component of this too is that the letter itself, and so take a couple minutes to read, one of the paragraphs. I've bolded a couple things I do want to point out. This letter also is a good example because it speaks to the issue locally, regionally, and really almost, globally. It talks about why the project is not actually helpful to the local community and the business center there in Pittsylvania County, Virginia. It talks about the deficiencies in what the decision makers did and why they did not have the best information that they could have to make their decision. And then it talks about the need for clean, renewable energy overall. So we'll have this example available to you too if you want to take more time to read with that. But what's important is the reader made it personal, they made it local, they made it concise, they made it factual, they responded to something so they could help with the narrative around this issue. And that's why your advocacy in this way is super important and is something you can do year-round and is always incredibly helpful. We also have some tools that we can share about best practices for writing letters to the editor. So don't feel that you have to have all this information in your head just yet. We'll have those in the chat with some great talking points specific to the SSEP and to the T-15. So now I'll put it back to Juhi to talk about next steps for tonight's program.
Awesome. Thank you, Jess, and thank you,